love Brazil because it is a very robust and very interesting business culture here. It's a business culture based around the 200 million smart people here, a land mass roughly equal to the United States, with multiple growing seasons, fresh water, tremendous natural resources available here, a democratic political system, and just, it seemed like everything was right. And then I'm sure you've heard 1,000 times already the old saying that, Brazil is the country of the future and always will be, right? Because they just couldn't seem to get traction here. It was always one thing after another. It was always a political upheaval, it was hyperinflation, it was the United States putting up huge barriers to importing the ethanol. It was always something getting in the way. And as I thought about that, I thought of sort of why, what's the context of that? So I looked at it from a sort of the American perspective. What is the context of the issues here? And I sort of brought them down into bullets. I mean, one is certainly this idea of isolationism here, brought on by a political system. I mean, certainly there was the politics of the military junta here for roughly 20 years, varying political systems, various political players, the business aspect of kind of the distrust and almost in some cases hatred between the business environment and the political environment. Also the economic isolationism caused by the hyperinflation, caused by the protectionism, but that also led to a certain level of self-sufficiency. We're in Brazil, we can do it on our own. We don't need all these gringos down here. So that isolated the situation as well. Geographically, I mean, obviously a very large landmass in Latin America, which is, never kind of had the same cachet as Europe and the United States. It was always sort of the quiet continent, except if you were talking about drugs or military governments or Evita or something like that. But this geography was interesting because it's the Portuguese surrounded by Spaniards, and there's a great deal of jealousy between everybody here. I can tell you some great sort of Brazilian-Argentinian jokes. Very funny. And then language also. Portuguese is, I think, the 7th or 8th most spoken language in the world, relatively limited to Portugal, Brazil, Macau, and a couple of countries in Africa, Angola. So, interesting because this culture, and I'd love to think about the culture as I look back and think, if you think about the American culture, we sort of came up on the whole puritanical aspect. The Puritans came, it created this, getting away from tyranny, kind of, self-sufficiency, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Well, the Portuguese were much more trade-oriented. So they came here with the idea of extracting stuff, water, food, minerals, bringing in the slaves from the various other colonies and creating an environment that really was one of extraction. And I think if you look at Brazil, that tends to continue on today, that thought process, rather than necessarily everything's win-win, the tide rises all ships sort of thing. It becomes more zero-sum here very often. So you have to think about that in the context of doing business. So, in my opinion, it led to something of an insular and maybe even sort of adolescent type of business culture, but one that at the same time is very robust. It sort of created this protectionist cocoon around business here. So that's the one aspect, is you have a certain level of business that is very protectionist, very insular, very who you know, not necessarily what you know or what you have. On the other hand, there is a level of international players like Ike Batista, 7th richest man in the world, who trained in Europe, came back here, had a very important dad, again, who you know, who will pick up the phone when he calls everybody in the country from the top down. So that's incredibly important here. And he was able to parlay that and the friends and friends and family aspect into this huge business because he really used international business standards to be able to bring the international people in. that's an area that I see a concern right now, is that a lot of businesses here, because of the way the business culture has grown, don't necessarily adhere to the same business standards and governing standards, the same reporting standards. So there's a disconnect, and we see that very often. We have foreign investors that want to come here. We show them a business, and it's like, well, you know, where's the audited financials? And these guys have been very often sort of winging it over the years for a variety of reasons, tax included. And at the same time, you have the Ambevs, you've got the Petrobras, you have the Vale. I mean, you have some very important international companies here that do everything on the up and up by the rules. So, this sort of unique cultural, isolationist to some extent, business environment has brought up a couple of issues that I'd love everybody to talk about and think about. I'd love to get your perspective, because I'm giving you my American in Rio perspective on this. One is protectionism. I mean, it is ensconced here in the business environment. Perfect example is in the 70s, Brazil was the #2 shipbuilder in the world. Huge, huge. Basically supported by the maritime, the Maritime Marine Fund. I'll think of the name in a minute. And then the oil boom, the oil crisis came along in the 70s, the money ran out, and the shipbuilding industry here basically vanished. It just evaporated because there wasn't the protectionism to be able to, and the support structure to be able to keep it up. At the same time, South Korea and China became major shipbuilding countries. So, you know, did that protectionism work? Well, now the shipbuilding industry is coming back because Petrobras has a very high local content requirement for these ships. So that's causing people to have to build ships here. So again, we're getting sort of back into the protectionist way of looking at things. It didn't work in the first place. Sort of why would it work now is my question. And on the other hand, aerospace. If you look at Embraer, I believe they're the 3rd largest builder of commercial jets in the world. I think if you take the personal jet craft into it, I think they're the 4th largest after the Canadians. But they did not openly go after these kinds of protectionist policy. Of course, it's Brazil. So, of course, there was always something going on politically where, you know, we'll give you a little bit of tax break here, we won't tax the avionics that you have to bring in as much as anybody else. So there's always some sort of magic going on. But the thought was really to create a true, innovative, high-tech business in aeronautics here. And that was back in the 70s also. And that has really built up to be quite a stellar example of what can happen. Just the revenues in 2011 of Embraer was about $5.7 billion. So that's an area where, you know, if you go after innovation, building a good product, and getting away from the protectionism, I really feel like it's a better way to go. The other area I'd love to talk about is innovation. And what I'd really like to say, from my perspective, is a sort of lack of innovation here. You know, I think the protectionism certainly is squashing a lot of that thought. I think the bureaucracy here squashes a lot of the innovation. It's just so difficult to manage that. But it's something I think we have to be able to deal with. And I did some research and looked up on Fast Company about a year ago, did the 10 most innovative Brazilian companies. The first one was Azul. Basically the JetBlue guy, right? So aircraft, airlines is first. The second is Ambev, beer. Third is Petrobras, oil and gas. Fourth was Asklin, which is basically clothing, sustainable, chic Brazilian clothing. Embrapa, which is the sort of like a Monsanto almost in the tropical agricultural sciences. Natura, cosmetics. Embraer, aircraft. Metal Frio, which are basically white goods, specific white goods. And then hearing aids, solar ear. A lot of these companies were started by either Brazilian-born foreigners like Azul or foreigners that came down here. But if you look at that list of the most innovative companies in Brazil, well, where's the technology? Where's the future stuff? You know, where's the next big thing when you're talking about innovation? And number 3 is an oil and gas company, and number 1 is a cheap, you know, a cut-rate airline to get people out of buses and into airplanes. So you think about, well, how did that happen? You think, well, okay, information technology, another area that was protected by the government through protections and policies. And basically over a 10-year period from roughly, I think it's like 97 through 07, through that 10-year period, they had a real push on innovation. Lots of help for companies, and of course, some companies were helped, but in that time, in the overall world ranking of technology and innovation, I think Brazil started out at like number 27, and after 10 years of all this hard work and protectionism, they ended up at number 27. So, going back, innovation and protectionism, I think are the 2 areas that I'm really having the most problem with, and a sort of bureaucracy. I mean, the ability to get things done here, and to pay the myriad of taxes, and to get things imported here, and the 102 forms we have to fill out to bring this makeup and beauty products into this country are just completely outrageous. But that's just my American perspective here. Please, Edouard.